The next endocrine organ that will be discussed will be the adrenal glands, and these are also referred to often as the suprarenal glands. Renal is our name for kidneys, and supra for superior. So the suprarenal glands, or adrenal glands, can be found above each of the kidneys. We have two of these, and these are very, very highly vascular, just like the thyroid gland is. And we're going to start with the anatomy of the adrenal glands, and then we're going to make our way into the hormones that are released from its different parts. So the adrenal gland actually has quite a few different parts, and each part is going to secrete something different. And we start with the capsule that can be found on the outside of the adrenal gland. Now the capsule doesn't secrete anything, but it is a protective connective tissue layer that sits on the outside of the adrenal gland. But we'll see that below this is where our secretory tissue begins. We have two major regions, the outer adrenal cortex, which is this region shown here, and we have the inner adrenal medulla, which can be found in here. And we're also going to come to see that the adrenal cortex has three major layers to it, and each layer is going to release something different, and we'll find that the adrenal medulla is going to release some of its own products as well. So the cortex is found on the outside, and the medulla is found on the inside. And both of those are covered with this capsule that can be found on the outside. So let's first dig into the adrenal cortex. Again, that's this region that can be found right here. There are three layers to the adrenal cortex. From superficial to deep, they are the zona glomerulosa, the zona fasciculata, and the zona reticularis. GFR. That is the order in which these three layers will sit that make up the cortex. And you can see those shown here also. Here you can see, actually you can see the capsule out here. You can see the zona glomerulosa, the zona fasciculata. This is the middle layer. The zona reticularis, and then we'll find our adrenal medulla that is found inside of that. So you can actually see that this is a really nice little section for us to see what different parts can be found on the adrenal gland. Now each of these layers is going to release something different. And each of the groups of molecules that are released by various layers are going to have different functions. So we'll see that the zona glomerulosa, which is the outermost of the three layers of the adrenal cortex, we call it the outer zona glomerulosa, this is going to secrete a group of molecules known as mineralocorticoids. Mineralocorticoids is a group of molecules that's named because it affects our body's mineral homeostasis. And the major mineralocorticoid that we're going to discuss is aldosterone, but I will mention all of that again on another slide. Now the middle layer, the middle zona fasciculata, is going to secrete an additional group of molecules known as glucocorticoids. The major glucocorticoid that we're going to be focusing upon is cortisol, and this group of molecules, the glucocorticoids, is named because they're going to affect glucose homeostasis. So each of these groups of molecules is going to give you some indication about what it's going to do. And then below this, we have the inner zona reticularis, and this is going to secrete androgens. So these are the three layers that make up the adrenal cortex, which is only part of the adrenal gland. You can also see the adrenal gland shown here. So to make sure that you have all this in writing, the outer zona glomerulosa is going to release mineralocorticoids. Those are going to be used for mineral homeostasis. Minerals are things like sodium and potassium. We'll see how this works in just a short second. We'll see the middle zona fasciculata is going to release a group of hormones known as glucocorticoids. And these glucocorticoids are going to regulate glucose homeostasis. This is cortisol. Cortisol is going to be our major glucocorticoid. Aldosterone is going to be our major mineralocorticoid. And then the zona reticularis, which is the innermost layer, will release our androgens. One major example of an androgen is testosterone. So this is going to be associated with masculinity. So we're going to go through each of these layers. Once again, we're going to discuss the particular hormones that are released from each layer, and then we're going to talk about what controls the secretion of that particular type of molecule. We see these are things that I've mentioned so far. Aldosterone is going to help regulate sodium and potassium homeostasis, but we have not talked about how this happens. And there's a major pathway, the RAS pathway, that's going to be important for controlling the release of aldosterone or mineralocorticoids. So I'm saying the RAS pathway, but you might be wondering where the S comes in. So this stands for renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system pathway. So the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone pathway is good enough. You can say the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system. Regardless, any of those names are appropriate. But the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system is a very involved system, and it's going to lead to the release of aldosterone. So before I jump into the RAA pathway, I'd like to let you know that this is going to be one of the more involved pathways that we're going to see here with the endocrine system. Now, on page 647 and also 648, you will find this pathway explained. You'll actually find this very picture on page 648, and you'll find each of these steps explained in detail on page 647, which is why I selected to put that page on here. But this, again, is highlighted now in red. This is a very, very important pathway for us to keep in mind. So we're going to go through each of these step by step. So one thing to keep in mind about the RAAS pathway is that this is going to be directly related to our body's blood pressure. This system also involves many different organs, and that's why it can seem rather complex. So let's break this down and do our best to make this as easy as possible. So we start this pathway with any type of stimulus that's going to decrease blood volume. So the three examples here are dehydration, a sodium deficiency, or a hemorrhage. All three of those are going to lead to a decrease in blood volume. Blood volume can simply be defined as the amount of volume there is within the cardiovascular system. So when our body gets dehydrated, we're going to end up losing a lot of that water, and that leads to less water in the vessels. Same thing with a sodium deficiency. If we don't have enough sodium in our blood, that's going to prevent the retention of water. And a hemorrhage is going to mean profuse bleeding. And so if we are bleeding and we're losing blood, that's going to decrease blood volume. So really anything, any type of stimulus that's going to decrease blood volume can start this pathway off. So first off, we've had our stimulus that's lowered our blood volume, and that's what we get here. We get a decrease in blood volume. Now this is directly related to our blood's pressure. That's going to put more stuff on the inside of our blood vessels and cause more pressure to be pushing against the walls of the vessels. So we lead to a decrease in blood pressure when there's a decrease in the blood volume. So by step 3, we're already starting to involve the heart and the vessels. There's a special cell in the kidney known as the juxtaglomerular cell. And when our blood pressure decreases, this juxtaglomerular cell is going to be stimulated to release the enzyme known as renin. And this is where we get the R in our name here, so renin. As those juxtaglomerular cells in the kidney release renin, their concentrations in the bloodstream are going to increase. Now, renin, being an enzyme, is a catalyst for chemical reaction. It's going to speed up a chemical reaction. And the reaction that it speeds up is the conversion of angiotensinogen into our molecule angiotensin 1. Angiotensinogen is a plasma protein that is synthesized by the liver. So the liver is going to be releasing this, and when renin is present and angiotensinogen is present, this enzyme is going to convert angiotensinogen into angiotensin 1. And keep in mind, this process is going on inside of the blood vessels. We release renin into the blood, and angiotensinogen is going to be into the blood. And so whenever these interact with each other in the blood, they're going to start making more and more angiotensinogen. And then, I mean to say angiotensin 1. When there's increased renin and increased angiotensinogen in the bloodstream, that's going to cause this reaction to promote the production of angiotensin 1 in the bloodstream. So there's going to be a high concentration of angiotensin 1 in the blood when we have decreased our blood volume. So now we have increased levels of angiotensin 1 in the bloodstream. Now, as this blood makes its way up to the lungs, specifically in the capillaries of the lungs, the endothelium of the capillaries in the lungs release another enzyme known as angiotensin converting enzyme, also abbreviated as ACE. Just as its name might suggest, angiotensin converting enzyme is going to convert angiotensin 1 into angiotensin 2. Once angiotensin 2 is now present in high concentration in the blood, this hormone is going to have two major roles to play. The first of those roles is that angiotensin 2 is going to make its way over to the adrenal cortex and stimulate the release of aldosterone. So aldosterone, again, is our mineralocorticoid. This hormone came all the way from decreased blood volume down to releasing renin and angiotensinogen into angiotensin 1 and angiotensin 2. The whole reason we were doing all this was so that we could get aldosterone from the adrenal cortex. Now remember, aldosterone's major role is to regulate mineral homeostasis, and we started this whole cascade off with a decrease in blood volume. The goal of this entire process is to return blood pressure back to normal that was caused by the decrease in blood volume. And aldosterone is going to help in that process. So this hormone is eventually going to circulate throughout the blood, and when it makes its way to the kidneys, it's going to directly tell the kidneys to increase its rate of sodium reabsorption. Now, once sodium is reabsorbed back into the blood, that's going to pull more water into the blood via osmosis, and that will in turn increase blood volume. Now, this water that was pulled into the bloodstream was pulled from the urine, and therefore we will end up urinating less during this cascade. We're going to end up essentially not losing as much water. We're going to pull that back into the blood to increase blood volume. Now, if the blood's overall volume increases, there's going to be more stretch going on inside of the vessels, and that will in turn increase blood pressure until it is back to normal. Now, that might seem like the end of the cascade, but I did mention that angiotensin 2 has two major roles. This was one. Stimulating the release of aldosterone was the first role, but the second role is going to be to stimulate smooth muscle contraction in the walls of the arterioles. So it's going to facilitate a process known as vasoconstriction. For those of you that have never heard of vasoconstriction before, just be aware that our large blood vessels are going to have a very thin layer of smooth muscle wrapping around the vessels. When those smooth muscles constrict, they're going to decrease the overall space that can be found inside of the blood vessels, and that will also aid in the increase of blood pressure. So this whole cascade started with a decrease in blood volume, some type of stimulus leading to a decrease in blood volume, and a decrease in blood volume will always lead to a decrease in blood pressure. So we have to have a way that we can increase that blood pressure back to normal, and that is through the RAS pathway. Now, there is one other thing I did want to mention about this slide, and that is number 16 here. Increased potassium in the interstitial fluid is also going to aid in aldosterone secretion, so this will also play in here as well. Now, like I said, aldosterone is our major mineralocorticoid, and that's going to be the one we'll focus on. However, we also will have the zona fasciculata, and that layer of the adrenal cortex is going to release the glucocorticoids, also known as cortisol. Now is the time we're going to see that negative feedback loop from a few slides ago that I told you we didn't have to do at the time, but now we're going to go over that negative feedback loop. So this is showing us the control in the release of glucocorticoids. So our controlled condition is our level of glucocorticoids, and when that concentration decreases in the bloodstream, that's going to eventually make its way up to the neurosecretory cells in the hypothalamus, which are going to be sensing for glucocorticoid level. And the hypothalamus is then in turn going to release corticotropin-releasing hormone. Then corticotropin-releasing hormone is going to make its way down to the corticotrophs. That's our group of cells found in the anterior pituitary gland. And then the anterior pituitary cells, the corticotrophs, are going to release adrenal corticotropic hormone in response to corticotropin-releasing hormone, as well as a decreased amount of cortisol in the blood. So ACTH will then make its way down to the zona fasciculata, that is that middle layer in the adrenal cortex, and then we're going to stimulate the release of more glucocorticoids. Once the level of glucocorticoids is back to normal, we have then seen our negative feedback loop make its way around in the circuit. So this just goes to show once more how important negative feedback is when discussing the endocrine system. Now, there are other glucocorticoids, but cortisol is the most prominent of all of them. Cortisol makes up about 95% of all glucocorticoid activity, so that's going to be the major one that we're going to focus upon. Now, there are 6 major roles of glucocorticoids, and you can see all 6 of those are listed here. Now, protein breakdown and lipid breakdown are 2 major roles of cortisol. This is going to start to break down the substituent parts that are necessary for glucose formation. And remember, when we have glucose present, we're going to be able to use that to make more ATP. Cortisol is also known as the stress hormone, so all of these are going to be necessary in maintaining our energy in times of stress. We'll also see that cortisol does offer us a resistance to stress, and this is done in part by the glucose that was formed up here. Now, this does not cause inflammation, but this actually has anti-inflammatory effects. Glucocorticoids actually inhibit white blood cells, so this will end up decreasing inflammation. And lastly is the depression of immune responses. High doses of glucocorticoids are going to prevent many immune cells from carrying out their typical job and wreaking havoc within the body. So these are 6 major roles of glucocorticoids, also known as cortisol. There's only a couple things that I'm going to mention about the most inner layer of the adrenal cortex, which is the zona reticularis, and that is going to be the layer that releases androgens. And the major androgen that's going to be released by our zona reticularis is dehydroepiandrosterone. That is a mouthful, so you can call this DHEA. Now, we don't see this hormone having a great effect in males as there's more testosterone release after puberty. However, in females, DHEA is eventually going to be used to make estrogen, and it also stimulates the sex drive. The secretion of DHEA is mostly going to be regulated by way of adrenocorticotropic hormone that's coming from the anterior pituitary gland. So that will conclude the 3 layers of the adrenal cortex, and that takes us to the adrenal medulla, that inner part that's found covered up by the adrenal cortex. Now, the adrenal medulla's major role in the body is to release catecholamines. And catecholamines is just a big fancy word for norepinephrine and epinephrine. Norepinephrine and epinephrine can also be referred to as adrenaline and noradrenaline. The adrenal medulla is actually a modified sympathetic ganglion of the autonomic nervous system. And that's why it's going to be stimulated by sympathetic preganglionic neurons of the ANS. Now, to focus on what we really need to know about the adrenal medulla are the chromaffin cells. The chromaffin cells are the cells that are going to be releasing our catecholamines. So this response is going to augment our body's fight or flight response. Since the autonomic nervous system directly controls the chromaffin cells, epinephrine and norepinephrine can actually be released quite quickly. So to summarize the hormones that come from the adrenal gland, we have 2 major places that we're going to look at, the adrenal cortex and the adrenal medulla. And we will first see that the adrenal cortex is made up of 3 layers, the zona glomerulosa, the zona fasciculata, and the zona reticularis. So the zona glomerulosa is going to release our mineralocorticoids, which is our aldosterone. We have the RAS pathway taking place here. And we have the glucocorticoids, which is mostly cortisol. 95% of our glucocorticoids is going to be cortisol. And that's going to come from the zona fasciculata, that middle layer. The presence of angiotensin II from the RAS pathway, as well as increased potassium in the blood, are going to stimulate the release of aldosterone. And the purpose of our mineralocorticoids is to increase our blood levels of sodium and water. Again, the more sodium that we increase in our blood, the more water is going to get pulled into the blood by osmosis. The release of cortisol, our major glucocorticoid, is going to be the release of adrenocorticotropic hormone from the anterior pituitary. And as I look at this, I'm seeing that this is improperly labeled over here. So this is not, in fact, the principal action. This is going to be the principal action of our androgens. So you can scroll back a couple slides to see the principal actions, but I'll just go ahead and tell you once again what the 6 major actions are of cortisol. Number 1 is protein breakdown. Number 2 is lipolysis. Both of those things are going to eventually aid in the formation of glucose, which is our 3rd action, the glucose formation. This is in turn going to help with resistance to stress, which is going to be our 4th action. And the last 2 actions of cortisol is going to be our anti-inflammatory effects as well as our immune response depression. Now we'll see that this is in the correct place when we discuss the androgens. So DHEA, dehydroepiandrosterone. If you are daring and want to try to say that long word, this is going to come from the zona reticularis. This is also going to be stimulated by adrenocorticotropic hormone. Again, that's going to come from the anterior pituitary. And in women, it's going to get converted into estrogens and also promote the sex drive. Lastly, for the adrenal medulla, or epinephrine and norepinephrine, those are going to be released by the chromaffin cells that can be found in here. These are directly linked to the autonomic nervous system, so we will actually see the autonomic nervous system aiding in its release. The sympathetic preganglionic neurons are going to lead to the stimulation of the chromaffin cells, and then the chromaffin cells are going to release noradrenaline and adrenaline. So the whole purpose of this adrenal medulla is to release epinephrine and norepinephrine to intensify the fight-or-flight response during times of exercise or times of stress. So lastly, we have 3 conditions here that are related to the adrenal gland. They are Cushing syndrome, Addison's disease, and pheochromocytoma. I'll start with Cushing syndrome and Addison's disease because they are opposites. Cushing syndrome is a hypersecretion of cortisol, and Addison's disease is going to be a hyposecretion of our glucocorticoids, which I could have also written as cortisol. So just keep in mind we're talking about the same thing. Now, if there's too much release in cortisol, we're going to end up with hyperglycemia, too much sugar in the blood. There's going to be excessive breakdown of proteins as well as a redistribution of body fat. And we're left with these 2 very, very characteristic symptoms, the moon face and the buffalo hump. And you can see this individual has this here, this buffalo hump, and he'll have the moon face here. So there's going to be flushing on the cheeks, and the face ends up being more rounded in shape. Addison's disease, on the other hand, is a hyposecretion of glucocorticoids, so not enough cortisol in the blood. Oftentimes, this is caused by an autoimmune condition where antibodies will actually block the binding of adrenocorticotropic hormone to its receptors, and therefore we can't release cortisol into the bloodstream. This, of course, will cause hypoglycemia because we don't have enough cortisol to be breaking down and producing enough glucose. And one of the major characteristics of Addison's disease is bronzed skin. Sort of will appear as if you've had some type of nice suntan, which is what our president JFK seemed to look like. So JFK was suffering from Addison's disease. And lastly is pheochromocytoma. This refers to a tumor of the chromaffin cells. And this leads to a hypersecretion of both epinephrine and norepinephrine from the chromaffin cells. Ultimately, that leads to a very prolonged fight or flight response because we're going to have too much release of epinephrine and norepinephrine. So we tend to see increased metabolic rate, nervousness, sweating, decreased gastrointestinal motility, all symptoms that would be associated with an increased sympathetic response.